Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm just so glad you joined me for another episode in the Mica Francis case. It's time to talk a little more about my favorite idiot's offspring, John Paul Miller. I'll be rehashing some of what I covered in yesterday's short video, but I'll also be talking about new and exciting things. Before I get started, I'm still getting comments from those of you who subscribe to the channel because of Micah's case, and the comments are about how you're glad to see me again. I've been here the whole time talking about other cases. You just won't necessarily see them in your YouTube feed because YouTube thinks that the only case you care about is Micah's. So if you want to know every time I publish something and you're already subscribed, you have to make sure your subscription notifications are on and set to all. If you aren't subscribed, why not? I'm flippin' delightful. Seriously, though, if you aren't subscribed but want to listen to me ramble, sometimes incessantly, about true crime from the 19th century until now, hit the subscribe button and follow the same directions about selecting all notifications. Okay, enough of that already. I think I have mostly gotten over being pouty about John Paul Miller's indictment not carrying a harsher sentence. His arraignment is scheduled for January 12th, and does anyone think he'll enter any plea other than not guilty? And when it comes to either taking a plea bargain or going to trial, will his big man baby cowardice win out and he'll take a plea? Or will his narcissism rule the day and he'll insist on going to trial because he thinks he can beat the charges? I kind of hope the narcissism wins because that could mean him actually getting the maximum sentence. So come on, John Paul. You can beat the federal government. I'm sure they're just making up all the proof they have against you. Fight them in court. Tell them to put up their collective dukes. There is a chance that Rumpled Russell's already working on a plea deal with prosecutors. And if so, at the arraignment, John Paul could plead guilty as part of the deal. Maybe Rumpled will even have his suit pressed before he goes to federal court, since it's super big boy court. He might even be ours to shave for the day. Wouldn't that be something? And if John Paul doesn't show up with his spiffy corduroy JanSport backpack, I will be horribly disappointed. There has been some confusion about the actual indictment, and I also think there's been some deliberate misinformation put out there to make it seem more sensational than it is. So I'm going to read the indictment and then we'll talk about it. So it starts with the background. The defendant, John Paul Miller, resided in the District of South Carolina. The defendant, John Paul Miller, was the lead pastor of Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and victim one was the wife of the defendant, John Paul Miller, until her death on April 27, 2004. Count 1. Cyberstalking. The grand jury charges that beginning on or around November 16, 2022, and continuing through on or about April 27, 2024, in the District of South Carolina and elsewhere, the defendant, John Paul Miller, with the intent to kill, injure, harass, intimidate, or place under surveillance with the intent to kill, injure, harass, intimidate victim 1, used interactive computer services, electronic communication services, electronic communication systems of interstate commerce, and other facilities of interstate and foreign commerce to engage in a course of conduct that placed victim 1 in reasonable fear of death and serious bodily injury and attempted to cause, and the course of conduct would be reasonably expected to cause to victim 1 substantial emotional distress, to wit, John Paul Miller sent or caused to be sent unwanted and harassing and electronic communications to victim 1, used or threatened to use nude photos and photographs of victim 1 to harass victim 1, posted a nude photograph of victim 1 online without victim 1's consent, placed or caused to be placed tracking devices on vehicles used by victim 1, placed victim 1 or caused victim 1 to be placed under surveillance with the intent to harass and intimidate victim 1, damaged victim 1's vehicle, interfered with victim 1's finances and banking, and interfered with victim 1's daily activities, in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 2261A, 2A, and B. Count 2. False statements. The grand jury further charges, on or about October 17, 2024, in the District of South Carolina and elsewhere, the defendant, John Paul Miller, did knowingly and willfully make a materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statement and representation in a matter within the jurisdiction of the executive branch of the government of the United States. To wit, he falsely claimed victim 1 had, I think that's supposed to be had been, calling him more than he had called victim 1 on March 11, 2024, when in fact the defendant, John Paul Miller, called victim 1 at least 50 times more than she called him. He falsely claimed police had never told him to stop contacting victim 1, when in fact the defendant, John Paul Miller, was told on March 11, 2024, by a police officer with the Horry County Police Department to stop contacting victim 1. He falsely claimed he did not damage victim 1's tires or cause to be damaged, when in fact the defendant, John Paul Miller, used or caused to be used a tire deflation device in victim 1's tires, in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1001A2. So even though it kind of sounds like the FBI indicted John Paul for intending to kill Mica, that section, the intent to kill, injure, harass, intimidate, etc., is just the verbiage of the code that John Paul violated. So even if someone is found to have cyberstalked someone and it never involved a death, their indictment would have the same verbiage on it. Further down, it explains that his conduct placed Mica in reasonable fear of death and serious bodily injury, and that it caused her emotional distress. If he was actually being charged with harassment that led to her death, his maximum charge would be a lot more than 5 years. The maximum for that would more than likely be life in prison, not the death sentence. From 1988 to 2018, the federal government only gave the death penalty in 78 cases, so a little over 2 a year. As I said before, these charges that he did get could be the foundation for additional charges. If or when they find him guilty of cyberstalking, they might connect it to Mica's death. There has been some talk about why the indictment doesn't use Mica's name but uses victim 1 instead. It could just be that the prosecutors want to keep Mica's name out of it for the sake of her family. I'm sure they realize that everyone knows who John Paul was married to. They just don't want to be the ones putting her name out there. But it could be that there are more victims that John Paul be charged with cyberstalking. And I wouldn't be mad if the federal government wanted to give us all a Christmas present like that. An indictment against John Paul every other day. Oh, the dreams I dream. I think John Paul has known the indictment was coming. He's been getting his affairs in order. I also think that's why Reggie stepped down as administrator of his own group. It could also be why John Paul wasn't arrested for stealing the protesters' signs, because the county knew he'd be busy with other legal issues. Yes, he could still go to court while he's in federal custody, but would the cost be viable? Meaning, if he's in the federal pen, would they want to pay the cost of having him transferred or any court procedures for a misdemeanor? Does that make sense? And I realize it doesn't seem fair, and that's because it's not. I think it's ridiculous that Reggie was charged with accepting stolen goods, but the person who made the said goods earned the adjective of stolen wasn't arrested. And I could just be talking out my backside about all of that. I was thinking last night about how much gall it takes for John Paul to lie to the FBI and think he was going to get away with it. I think this might be more of John Paul thinking he can get by with any lie because he just has to say he's a pastor and people will believe him. Well, not anymore, bucko. So did he think his private investigator was going to lie to the FBI too and back up his nonsense story about how the only reason he hired the PI was to make sure that Micah didn't buy a gun? Sorry, John Paul. I don't think you're going to find too many people who are willing to go to prison for you. Let's talk about John Paul's various supporters for a bit. It'll be interesting to see how many of his groupies show up for cult time this Sunday. Also, protesters, do you have a sign ready with one of the headlines about John Paul being indicted on it? Because I'm sure John Paul would love seeing a sign like that. And all of you who defended John Paul on social media, you know who you are. Don't make me name names. How you feeling now? Still think he's just an innocent little lamb who never did no one no harm? Or are you still so enamored with Bat Boy that you think the FBI is just making up the charges against him? If you need to be reminded about what you said about him, I still have the receipts. I wonder if they're going to have another little group about how poor John Paul is being mistreated by the feds. If they were clever, they would name it Fed Up. But they're not clever, so they're probably going to name it something like The Truthiest Truth That Ever Truthed, because they think if they put truth in the title of their group, that makes whatever they say in it the truth. And does anyone think our little Trisha Rita is regretting standing by her man? Is she worried about everything she's done, the things that John Paul had her do? She probably signed a lot of checks for him. And if she doesn't think John Paul will throw her under the bus so fast it'll make her spill her margarita, then she's in for a surprise. One of the many names that John Paul filed with the Secretary of State was Living Water at Market Common. And that was supposed to be the name of the church had they stayed at Market Common, I guess. So he switched all of that to Trisha's name, or at least to her address. And if she's the only one listed on the property, does that mean that she's responsible for the taxes? Because I looked up the property tax record for this year, and man, oh man, do they owe some taxes. Over $90,000. And that includes the 2 properties on Highway 17, JP's house, and his truck. So it looks as though Horry County doesn't consider Living Water a nonprofit or a church, since churches are supposed to automatically be a nonprofit. So maybe John Paul changing all the names for everything is coming back to bite him in the tuchus. And while we're talking about John Paul's cohorts, here are some things I shared in the Facebook group about Mark Kaufman, John Paul's bestie for the restie. Along with Mark getting a new LLC that he named Ka-Chow, I found that his plane that he's been taking all over the state this past year has been parked at the Beaufort Executive Airport in Beaufort, South Carolina since November 2nd. Weird. That's the same day that John Paul asked for 12 tithing church members to pray for him because he was facing a life or death situation. I was also sent a message about how on October 26th, Mark made a flight pattern that spelled out Ka-Chow. And I made the mistake of looking up what Ka-Chow could mean, besides being the catchphrase of Lightning McQueen from the movie Cars. And, well, I'll just say that some of the definitions have to do with semen and some have to do with buttholes. And does that mean that the rest of the drawing that Mark made with his flight pattern is supposed to be a cock and balls, like someone's deformed twig and berries? Seriously, Mark, what is your major malfunction? You and John Paul are 2 peas in the same misshapen little weird pea pod. And bad weird, not good weird. I adore good weird, but you 2 are not it. I've not seen proof of it yet, but there's a rumor out there that John Paul gave Marky Mark and his funky bunch power of attorney. Now, it might just be for his ownership in Crocodile Rocks and not complete power. But I have to wonder why he didn't sign it over to Baked Tater, considering she's his wife. Maybe he didn't want Baked Tater to know what he and Mark have been up to, or maybe they're worried she's going to be hit with some charges of her own, or maybe he just doesn't really like her that much. I think that's all I have for now. I'll be watching the news, just waiting for the magical phrase of additional charges have been handed down. Until then, I'll be talking about other true crime cases, so stick around. And as always, stay safe and be happy.